Hello guys, BJTHEBRAVE here, back with part 2 of the Ghaelyn Tempo Queen guide. Guys, I'm doing something that's a bit weird. I've not really done this before, but since I actually filmed and recorded the deck guide that you've hopefully just watched, if you haven't watched it, please go back and watch part 1, because then this is going to make more sense. But since I recorded that, I've actually played a heck of a lot more games with the deck myself, and I've learned a lot of things about the deck, and I've actually got statistics to share. So I thought I'd make a quick kind of addendum or a part 2, just to kind of go over some of those things. So what I'm going to do in this video particularly is share the stats from the games that I've played with you, and then I'm going to talk about a little bit more advanced tactics and details around the guide. So let's start with some of the statistics. So first of all, in total now I have played 35 games with this deck list, and I haven't changed the deck list, and they are 35 games where I've essentially climbed to rank 8 on the ladder, and they've all been against human opponents. So obviously I've played some bots, not that many, by the way. I have to say I've definitely noticed I'm playing a lot less bots, but when I do get a bot, I don't actually include it. You can see on the spreadsheet I've got a separate line for bots, but then I just actually ended up, there's no point me really recording them, because you pretty much get 100% win rate against them. So these are 35 games against human ranked opponents, climbing through the top 50. Okay, and as you can see, I've got a pretty insane 30 wins and 5 losses, giving me an 85.7% win rate. And I checked in with Shrigma Male, who is currently ranked, well, between him and Papa Beard, they're sort of fighting it out for rank 1. They keep swapping every 10 minutes. But he also is operating at around an 80% win rate as well with this deck. So let's just have a quick look. The irony is, obviously, with such a win rate, we've obviously got a positive win rate for the most part. Things worth pointing out, the funny part is that my worst nightmare is Zagstruck. Believe it or not, I've actually come up, not just with this deck, but across all my decks, I've come up against like 4 or 5 players, different players playing Zagstruck recently. I don't know where that's come from, but you know, there might be an interesting sort of mid-range, aggro-y mid-range Zagstruck deck. The burst is insane with Zagstruck, and I've actually lost 2 of the 3 matches that I played. Other things worthy of note is the Uriel match is a tough one. It's always close. You actually, and I'll talk more about this in a second, but you actually play more as the control deck against Uriel, and that's a really big difference compared to most of the other matchups. But once I've sort of figured that out, I'm doing pretty well against it. And then the other thing of note is, I think, Abaddon. So you can see that we've played 9 games. I think that's the majority. Yeah, if we look across the Warlords, Abaddon then Ghaelyn is the majority matches. So we've played 9 Abaddons, and we've actually got 8 wins. Now again, some of the matches with Abaddon have been pretty close, and by that I mean, you know, my HP's been below 10, and you know, it's been very close and intense and tactical, but at the same time, an 89% win rate against Abaddon. Of course, you have to take these numbers with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because it's 9 games, right? It's not 100 games, or 1,000 games. So you know, you have to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt. But still, I thought I'd share that with you overall, because it's pretty impressive. And to be honest, it's a bit OP. You probably shouldn't be. It doesn't matter how good a player you are or any of that. I would say like the best player in the game should really only be able to achieve, well, not that high a win rate anyway. The funny thing is, though, we're definitely not in a meta that is sort of OP for one particular Warlord like it was for Ghazghkull last season. It's been the best season so far. I've been climbing, and I was enjoying and climbing really well. I've positive win rates with Neurothrope, with Uriel, with Ghaelyn, with Grook, and you know, Swarm mode's even better than Neuro, probably. I just preferred the Neuro version. So it's really cool. It's a fun season, lots of variety and lots of different ways to win. So let's just go back to the deck for a second. So I would say that I've learnt a few extra lessons since we did part 1. So let's just talk a little bit about those extra lessons. So let's just go through a few of the matchups. So against Uriel, I think what we said is, in general, we act as like the sort of beat down. So for example, I'll trade face with face quite early on. with most decks. Against Uriel, we don't do that, so we don't hit face. We very much play as the control player, and generally what happens is we start the first 5-6 turns. They are the beatdown, so we feels like we're losing, and we gradually try to stabilize the board, and then once the Uriel kind of perfect curve runs out, we tend to be more consistent. The sort of mid game, and that's where we start to take over. We also make sure to take the level 20 Forge stratagem if we're going second, because those extra 2 Spirit Stones can really help. Because I played a really close match, I think it was Snowfire from Ultramarines, where he just did a great job at removing all of the Spirit Stones. So when I was trying to play, you know, the Vengeful Wraithblade or the Spirit Seer, I was able to do that by using the Forge ability. So that's been pretty important to me. And I think also in a matchup where you are assuming the control mantle, it's much more important to find your flankers. I will often keep Howling Banshee, I will look for Shroud Runner, I will look for Wind Rider. These cards are much more important against Uriel, and I would also say the same is true against Chaos. So let's talk a little bit about Abaddon. Just to say, with the Uriel match, I find that as I said, we're losing to start with, and we can kind of stabilise. And as they try to keep up, their health will slowly come down to ours. And we do need to be careful about preserving our health, obviously, in that match. But often then the Hemlock and the Wailing Doom can kind of come down and finish it. If you're really struggling with Ultramarines, you could consider running the Evasive Maneuver, because that really just shuts down his ability to use Death from Above as a finisher. But it is a massive sacrifice to tempo, and people make that mistake all the time. They think that Evasive Maneuver is like always the answer, and it often isn't. When you're playing an aggro tempo deck, it's a bad card. You know you can't afford to lose that tempo. But as I say, it's a weird one, because you're actually the control deck. You're not the beatdown in that one matchup. So when we were in the Ultramarine meta, Elder players did run it because the majority of the matchups were against Ultramarines. If you are playing a majority of Ultramarines, then great, go ahead and put one in. But you will weaken your matchups elsewhere. And I just showed you my spreadsheet, right? So even though we played some Uriels, it by no means was the only deck we were facing. In fact, it wasn't even the main two. So you know, you do need to be very careful about sacrificing tempo when you're playing a tempo deck. Okay, so the Abaddon build. The big thing about the Abaddon deck, I've had a lot of success against it, and the main reason is been heavily focused on removing his troops in the first 5 turns, and the only way that we can do that is by having those flankers. So again, in other matchups, you're able to kind of drop your Guardians and kind of, you know, build a board more steadily. But you against Chaos, you can't afford to just leave a unit on the board for even a turn, sadly. So it's really important in the early game that, again, we find those Wind Riders, that we find our sometimes Eldritch Storm, I suppose, but I prefer like the Banshee and the Shroud Runners, and obviously the Nadu Fireheart is one, and sometimes even the the Vengeful Wraithblade is very good against Chaos. It's also quite good against Uriel. You know, the 6 attack can kill the Rhino, the Impulso, so that's something to consider in that match as well. But generally, if we remove the units early on and still attack face and keep bringing Abaddon's health down, we can usually finish the game before them, barring them getting off certain combos. You know, if you go too wide and then they get, like, you know, if they're playing like the sort of Draconum combo, that hasn't happened to me yet, but it could. I think the thing with that combo though is that it's very inconsistent. You know, from a ladder deck, the Chaos players can't just rely on that happening every time, and I wouldn't play around it too much, if I'm honest with you. If they get it, fair enough, but you know, over a season of playing Abaddons, you're not going to lose to it a majority of the time, not even close. So really the focus against Abaddon is focusing on removing those units, and in the sort of like Shrigma Male mirror match, you're really looking for, when I say Shrigma Male, I just mean if someone's playing another Ghaelyn Tempo deck, basically. But in the mirror match, I think what's really important is to recognise when they overstretch, and that's where the Eldritch Storm comes into play. It's really trying to figure out, often when they play the Warlock turn, for example, they'll try to maximise value on the Warlock, so they'll go a little bit wider, and that's the turn to hit them with the Eldritch Storm and kind of punish that. And it's really all about trying to edge. It's a real skill matchup because it's trying to edge advantages, so being a little bit more mindful of your Warlord health. Sometimes you can go down on health, but only if you calculate that the trade gives you a severe advantage on board position. We want to try, if possible, to be just ahead really, so that they're sort of 3 or 4 health points lower than us, so that we can be a turn closer to finishing them with our Wailing Doom or Hemlock than they can be to hitting us with theirs. Spirit Seer Quellenaris is actually very good in the mirror. The Eldar, as we know, they do struggle a little bit with high health units, so this unit can be very good. And actually, this is the first deck where I've actually really liked this card. I've been pretty down on this card, but and I was a bit skeptical when I saw that Shrigma was playing it, but I've realised that it's actually really good in this deck. It fits this nice slot. If you think about it, other than the Wraithblade, we don't really have a sturdy big unit in the deck, and it just sort of fills this mid-game hole, mid-range hole, mid-game hole. It's got really good range attack as well, so it can help us deal with enemy flyers and things like that. And again, it gives us another way to counter the Spirit Stone counterplay that our opponents will be trying to do. So for me, that's this card is overperforming actually and doing really well, and I'm actually really sold that it belongs in this version of the decks. Another thing that I'm quite sold on from playing the games is the Hemlock. I've always thought that 1 is enough, and I still think you could get away with 1, but actually I think what I've experienced with this deck is consistency. I know when Shrigma built the deck, he wanted to avoid RNG, and he wanted to really try and maximise the kind of consistency of the deck, and it's very common. My experience has been in these 35 games that it's very common that I, on turn 8, have either a Wailing Doom or a Hemlock, and that's because there's 3 cards in the deck that come with that, right? So, and certainly by sort of turn 10, which this deck generally wins the game by. If it goes that late, the only games that really go that late are sort of Imotech matchups and things like that. Speaking of Imotech, that's also been a favourable matchup. We've beaten some good Imotech players. What we do really against them is just build the board. We can just control the board against the Necrons better, trying to outbuild. I also think that trying to look for the combos, especially things like the not Spirit Seer, what's it called? The Exarch. Looking to sort of combo Fireheart with Exarch or the Spirit Seers, things like that. Getting a good mid-range combo off can really help with dominating the board against them. And once you do against the Necrons, they really struggle, because the problem they've got is that they've only really got one or two good AoE combos, and they don't really come till turn 9. And honestly, generally what happens is you do need to play around that, so you definitely don't want to overplay into the board, into that AoE, and as long as you do that cleverly and you think, if the AoE is my board right now for 9 energy, can I refill the board with threats? And that's literally the thought process that enables you to play around that. So other than that, they really can't do much about your board, and you tend to just sort of grind them down and dominate them. So we've talked about Abaddon, we've talked about Uriel. I think the Tyranids, it's a little bit similar to what we said about Abaddon actually. We want to really work hard to remove their units. Obviously, Tyranids have a bit more stealth, and the key there is thinking about having a counterplay to stealth, which is usually a Vanguard unit with this deck, or sometimes stunning. If they're close to lethal, we use our stuns effectively, so we want to look for like the Howling Banshee and the Banshee Mask to stun the Swarmlord, so that even if stealth unit survives, if they were thinking about playing the Ravenous Hunter combo next turn, well, they're not going to get the 10 damage from Swarmlord. So there's I've found that the stuns are really great in this deck. Again, I would say that you need to think about when to time your stuns sometimes. So there's definitely nothing wrong with using a Howling Banshee on turn 4. That's great. But then, like later in the game, I really usually try to use my stun on an Abaddon where I think he might have you know, a Draconum that could ruin my day, or I want to stun a Gazgul or a Gruk where I'm thinking a proper Killy is going to ruin my day. So, you know, when you get down to like that 15 health and you're playing Orcs, you should have been thinking all along about a stun for that scenario. And you've got 4 stuns in the deck, which is really powerful. I think stun's an excellent ability right now. So with, like I said, being able to stun the enemy warlords in particular is really good. So yeah, so against Gruk, let's talk about Gruk. The big thing we want to look for with Gruk is our Eldritch Storm. Now we want to control the board against Gruk and play quite aggressively in the early turn. As usual, we're really keeping the 1 and 2 drops, and we're only really keeping flankers that are outside of that. So things like the Fireheart or the Banshees, or you know, sometimes I'll keep Dance of Death. Actually, that's another one. But against Orcs, that helps us to really fight for the early game. And then really what we're trying to do is not overextend. So we've got to control the board, but not overextend. So we're thinking about that, like Will of Gork come turn 7. And again, thinking about the turns. If you're going in, if it's turn 5, it's fine to overextend because you know that he can't Will of Gork you next turn. So that's something to think about. I do get caught out a little bit sometimes by the Scorcher Assault. That's a thing. So you need to be mindful of that. You know, obviously that can take out things like a Warp Spider, etc. So that's something to play around. But generally, the way we beat Gruk is to control the board. Again, similar to Uriel, I actually start playing that match. I often play it as a control. Certainly against Gazgul, I'll play it more as a control. But against Gruk, I'm always weighing up whether it's right to hit face or not. Sometimes it is, because Gruk control is quite vulnerable, so I'll go in if I know it's control. But if it's Gruk aggro, you definitely want to play as the control deck. So the difficulty is obviously that you don't know that in the first few turns. So there is some guesswork there for sure. But the big equalizer is the Eldritch Storm in the Gruk match. So against Gruk, he generally plays the Green Horde. You know, we didn't see as much Green Horde last season with Gazgul. Many Gazgul decks didn't run it, including my own. But the Gruk versions do. And so you really need to be thinking about your Spirit Stone management. You need those 2 in the bank ready to Eldritch Storm. Again, the level 20 Forge ability can really help you there. But the Eldritch Storm after a Green Horde can often lead to them basically just conceding. So that's a really key card. I'd basically be looking for that in my opening mulligan against the Orcs. That's the big difference, I think, in that matchup. And generally speaking, you know, most of the games come down to us doing a good job of controlling the board, chipping away at damage, and then consistently drawing into and timing the Hemlock and the Wailing Doom. Don't just drop their Hemlock onto the board, you know, really try to think about, it might be turn 9 that it makes more sense. You know, it might make sense to only play out 7 energy on turn 8, including your Ghaelyn ability, you know, your Path of Command, because you've done such a good job at controlling the board, and you're actually waiting for his next big threat to use the Hemlock. So you just need to think a little bit more tactically around that. But generally speaking, the Hemlock and the Wailing Doom are just very, very good finishers for this deck. So there you have it, guys. As I say, very strong win rate with this deck. It's super good on ladder right now. I hope you found this helpful. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.